Welcome to the Book Faire Podcast. My name is Anthony, and this show is all about children's literature and the freedom to read. This week, we have an interview with Katie Yamasaki, muralist and author-illustrator of the new children's book, Ripples. Next week, we will have another episode covering new book releases, as well as another interview on Friday. Make sure to follow the podcast wherever you are currently listening to stay up to date on the latest news in children's literature. Let's begin with this week's interview. It's wonderful to meet you, Katie. Thank you so much for being here. Can you start off by introducing yourself for the audience and the book that we'll be discussing today?
My name is Katie Yamasaki, and I am an author and illustrator of many books for children, and I'm also a muralist. I've painted over 90 walls around the world, and I co-facilitate a few arts programs at women's prisons in upstate New York.
And did you begin as a muralist or did you begin as an illustrator for a publishing?
I originally wanted to be an illustrator, and I went to school for illustration. But when I finished grad school, I'd been at the MFA program at the School of Visual Arts for illustration. My books weren't ready, and I was submitting a lot of books and submitting a lot of work, but nothing was getting published. And then my friend's mom invited me to come and paint a mural in her middle school library in New Jersey. So I went over and did that, and that just kind of took off as its whole own thing. But the nice thing about that, that was 24 years ago. And the nice thing about that is that um, all of the murals are full of story and content and, social kind of understanding social situations through the lens of people in different communities around the world. And so the murals have driven a lot of the storytelling in my books and vice versa. So they're in close relation to each other.
And your newest book coming out that has recently come out, rather by the time this comes out,
Mhm,
is Ripples. Can you talk a little bit about this work?
mhm. Sure. Ripples is a book that came from some thinking around the idea of mothering and caretaking. And I was thinking about, how we have this, title. Some of us, are lucky to have this title of mother, but how the work of mothering is done by so many different people, by aunts and uncles, by older cousins and older siblings, by grandparents and other caretakers and teachers. And I was thinking about, how children learn to take care of themselves and each other and the world around them through the care that they receive from the different grown-ups in their life. And so the second part of that is how kind of collective action and collective caretaking makes these big jobs seem much smaller. So that when we work together doing things that are really natural to us, like caring for the environment, like tending to something, like cleaning something, like giving something space or someone space. When we do those things together, there can be a big impact. And I think that with regards to the young reader, I always like to think about how the young reader can leave the experience of reading a book with agency to take action. And I think that what I hope the book shows is that these things that we need to do to care for the environment and to care for our communities are things that we already know how to do. And so I'm hopeful that the reader will leave with kind of the sense of collective care as something that they're capable of and probably already doing.
And one of the things that you brought up there is something that I always love to kind of highlight anytime it comes up, because a lot of times books for young readers are tackling big ideas and sometimes will be handling serious issues that are impacting the entire world, things like pollution, climate change. You said agency, the ability to affect change in the world around them. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways that through the book or just throughout the life of a young reader that highlighting and taking advantage of the ways that they are given agency makes a difference in the world around them?
Yeah, I think, that's a great question, Anthony. And I think that, you know, the world is overwhelming, news is overwhelming, and the problems that children and teenagers are tasked with are overwhelming because, there's so much wrong, right? And my books, cover topics like mass incarceration, having a parent incarcerated or gentrification, or, the incarceration of the Japanese. There are these big, big topics, but within all of those things are people living their daily lives and our children, right? So, in Ripples, for example, we have this big lake that is polluted, and it's full of trash and it's full of people's waste. And you have this kid and her auntie who've kind of been traveling down the river, noticing all of the ways that their friends and their community along the river are being cared for. They're being celebrated, they're being tended to, they're being listened to, they're being kind of given space, they're being cleaned, they're being fed. And so when they get to the bottom of the river and it opens up into this lake that needs a lot of attention, the child, all of the things that need to happen, the child has seen and also has experienced on their own, and they know how to do. And so the thing that they realize is this is a big job for two people. But then when their friends will come down, it's like, oh, you know what? Actually, this is much less of a big job when we have everybody working on it together. And it's actually a joy to kind of do these things in part, in community. And so I think whatever the topic is, if we can, look at these big big problems, capital P problems that we're all kind of contending with when we turn on the news. But then take those and then make them small by looking at how we can be a good neighbor, how we can be a good present community member. Like, I have another book called Place Hand Here, and it's about a child who's waiting for his mom to come home from a time of incarceration. And what the story is really about is how he's connecting with a lot of people around this hand that's painted on the wall of his building, that everybody knows what it's like to miss somebody. So where you might not connect, you might not feel connected on all levels. There are small actions within every single issue that we can really relate on, that we can relate on this topic, that we all care, that we all care about the world that we live within. And, and what are some small things that we can do? I think that a lot of when I look at a lot of teenagers and people who are really struggling with anxiety, it's really natural response to, the news that we've all been absorbing. But I think that one um, way to handle that is to look immediately in the circle around us of like what we can do, and I think that a lot of the time doing the things in community can kind of alleviate a lot of that because it brings us into action.
And Katie, with your work as a muralist, I living in San Antonio, we see a lot of beautiful murals throughout some of the like historical parts of town, and they are beautiful, but they are also massive pieces of the community because they are made on the sides of buildings to represent a group of people that are sharing a common area or have a shared heritage. As the person that does these murals, not these specific ones, of course, but as a person who paints murals, what is some of your experience with connecting with communities and finding ways to represent that in the pieces that you make?
Sure. Sure. So for me, and I would love to come and see some murals in San Antonio, by the way. But my process is very participatory. So when it comes to kind of coming up with the idea for the mural, that's done in community with the people who occupy the building, who live in the community, who live in the neighborhood. Because at the end of the day, I likely don't live in that neighborhood, right? And I don't go to that. It's not my school, or that's not my community center, or not my theater, or not my museum, or whatever. It's of the people who live there and occupy that space. So I meet with them over time to conduct workshops and conversations and drawing exercises to really get at what it is that they want to communicate and they want to express. So, for example, I did a mural a couple years ago at a school that's actually not far from where I live, but it's at a school for kids with special needs. 100% of the kids there have significant special needs and also are bused from all over the city. At that time, 100% of them were also living at or below the poverty line. And it was a building that was surrounded by really intense gentrification. So, like, fancy hotel next door, luxury lofts across the street. And literally, this school was being cast into the shadows of this development. But the kids had, their own unique stories, and as did the teachers and the other educators in the space. And so they kind of wanted to show who they are to the community and also to themselves. So the kids picked like this giant symbol of a lion to show their bravery because we painted it after the pandemic and they were from some of the communities hardest hit in the city by the pandemic. And the teachers wanted to show themselves as protective. So we had this big lion and then we had all these, kids in different scenarios doing all of these things because they felt like, often people see us and they see us for our differences. But if a kid can walk by and be like, oh, I also play soccer. I also love to daydream. I also I'm a stargazer. I also love to draw with my friends, all of the things that the kids are doing around the base of this giant tiger or lion. Um, you know, it's a way for them to be seen in a different light, a community that's literally been pushed into the shadows. And so my process is very much about using murals as a platform for people who have a strong and meaningful and important voice, but their voice doesn't always have an outlet. So the mural can be the outlet. So similar, probably similar to what they're doing in San Antonio, but it's very much not about like what I want to see, but it's about what the people who are of that community and of that place want to see.
And now you also said that you went to school for illustration and that you had manuscripts that were being queried that you were waiting to hear back before you finally took on a job to do a mural, and that's kind of what took off first.
Yeah.
So, what kind of approach did you take with illustrations before the murals came in, and have the murals worked into your illustration work since then?
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, I mean, I was submitting manuscripts since 1999. I have that box of rejection letters that was you know, from 1999 through, 2018 or so. And I published a few books along the way, but I have always been making books while I'm doing all of these murals and while I was teaching. I taught for 14 years in public schools and always had many jobs, but my desire was always to have these books be made. And the stories changed that I was submitting through time, um, and my mural work definitely impacted my illustration. For a while, I tried to keep them separate. Like my illustrations would look like this, and my murals would look like this. But over time, my illustrations started to take on more of a mural look, and also just the stories that I was hearing and learning about through the process of doing these murals. Um, were the stories that I felt like, well, wow, like this should be a book. Why is this, these stories that come from a lot of the time people who have been pushed to the margins, um, these should also, besides being murals, these stories should also be books. So I have um, you know, my book, Everything Naomi Loved, is about I co-authored that with Ian Lendler, but that book was about a mural that I had painted that with a group of teenage girls where they were really communicating something about their own identity, but the building got knocked over because of gentrification and a high rise, apartments got built in its place. So I made a story that was kind of inspired by that. I have a book, Place Hand Here, and also Dad Bakes, that comes from a lot of my work with people who are incarcerated and their families who are impacted by that incarceration. And so they're very in conversation with each other. And so, when I do author visits, I'm talking about the book and then I'm also talking about the surrounding mural projects. Um, so the books all come from really, poignant moments of collaboration with different communities uh, uh, through a mural.
And now, Katie, you said that you've been submitting manuscripts since 1999. There are a lot of young people that maybe want to get into writing. They are aspiring writers, either fiction, nonfiction, poetry, or even illustrators who are looking to get into publishing. It is not a very forgiving industry. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience has been with from going from your initial manuscripts to getting a few published here and there, and now being able to publish such impactful and meaningful work that seems like so personal to you, what that has been like, and being able to be able to do that kind of work.
Thanks so much. That's such a nice question. I think you know, it has been such a journey. Now I look, I'm like, wow, 1999 was a long time ago. That was 27 years ago. And I think that, when I think back on that time, I I never saw the books that I was making. I always felt like they were ready. And now when I look back, I'm like, I can see why these got rejected. But I always cared a lot about the content, But in the meantime, I think that it would have been easy to be like, every all my energy is just going to go towards these books and towards this like single focus of getting published. But what I'm glad that happened was I'm glad that I kind of stumbled into mural painting, because what that did was like just build out my overall um life experience and kind of way that I experience and see the world and people that I've met and stories that I've encountered. It kind of just expanded my whole worldview so that the stories could get a lot deeper, and I think that like a lot of the time everybody chooses like a different approach of like where they see the need for the story that they want to make. And sometimes people are like, there's this story doesn't exist in the marketplace, and that could be one reason to make it. Or, this is like my own family story, so I want to tell it. And I think that the most important thing is that you care about the content and that you care about the characters, and that it is not so much to be like intentionally relatable to the whole world, but to be so specific into why that story matters and to what is uniquely wonderful about that story. And when you can be that specific and have had real um sincere and open like relationship with the story. So like for example, one thing I'm very aware of and cautious of when I work, because I work so much in different carceral facilities with people who are incarcerated and their families, is that it is never extractive. It's not like you're taking their story and building your life on their story. It's that you're working in collaboration with people because they want their story to be told. And so I think that like it took me a long time to kind of figure out how to I also was a teacher, so I felt like I needed to do things from a teacher perspective, like, kids need to learn this, and so I'm kind of it's just been a very long journey of, like, immense rejection, immense amounts of rejection, and then one really important thing for me was finding the agent who really believed in the value of both my mural work and my picture book work and the relationship between the 2, because the mural work was so busy that some people along my way have felt like it was a distraction and that it was a totally separate entity. But my agent who connected me with my current editor at Norton, Simon Boughton, they both Tanya McKinnon's my agent. They both have a deep appreciation for the relationship between those two things and how that makes like an artist. So I you know, like many people, had a journey through different, representation in different publishing houses. And I think to get to a place where I feel like my work is so well understood, that it makes the books, like the books that are coming now, I've been doing one book a year with Norton for the last 6 years. And it feels like very natural. In the past, I've been told things like, "Oh, if you do a book about incarcerated parents, like that's too sad. You can't do that. It's too sad." Or like you can't really do a book about like the incarceration of the Japanese because like, not everybody's going to want to read that. Like these are books that have heavy content, but from, plenty of life experience, any of us know that like within any story, within any context, what challenging social context, children are just living their lives, right? And it's not for me to say that like the life of this child is sad because like this is what's happening. It's like to find the humanity within that child and deliver their story, which is not, it's not the story like here's the story of a kid whose mom is incarcerated. It's like here's the story of a kid who lives in a community who has these adventures, and yes, this is part of the story, but this is not the entire story. So I think like this is a really long and winding answer to your question, but what I found is that in my journey to find the right editor and house and representation are people who appreciate complicating things, you know, and I in the quest to like find the good character and find the story, that it's okay to be complicated because that's life. Sorry for that long answer.
That's okay, Katie, because it segues perfectly into, the
Uh-huh.
the final question that I like to ask, all of my guests. It's a little more a little bit more introspective about yourself and the work that you do. And that is, Katie, how do you see yourself and the work that you do either as an author, an illustrator, a muralist, or as an artist? How do you see yourself and the work that you do?
Oh, I think I see myself in partnership, and I am somebody who, like, I didn't wanna be an artist when I was growing up because I felt like it was a lonely job. I felt like I didn't wanna just go to a studio and be by myself all day long, and I think that that's why murals felt really natural. But with all my stories and with all my murals and with my work teaching, everything that I feel like has been of meaning in my life has been in partnership with other people, and so what I hope is that that comes through in the books that, like, um, that these big things that we try to do are best done, with our community. That's how I was raised. That's been my education. And then that's been my continuing education as an artist. So I see myself in partnership with many communities.
Thank you. That was an interview with Katie Yamasaki. Her new book, Ripples, is out now. You can learn more about Katie and her work at katieyamasaki.com. If you appreciate the work being done on this show, there are a number of ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, or follow wherever you are currently listening to help push the show out to new listeners. Second, you can follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky at Book Faire Pod. Lastly, you can follow the show on Patreon at patreon.com/thebookfair. Following is free and there are no posts hidden behind a paywall. Of course, the best way to help the Book Faire podcast grow is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk to you next time.